Rain drummed steadily against the leaded windows of Gideon Hale's general store, turning the narrow streets of Ashcroft into ribbons of mud and reflecting the dull glow of gas lamps already burning though the afternoon had scarcely faded. The warm scent of fresh bread, lamp oil, cinnamon, leather, and cedar drifted through the crowded shop, where polished shelves overflowed with flour sacks, preserves, tea tins, sewing thread, and imported goods that most townsfolk admired more often than purchased. Yet on that gray day, none of those comforts could soften the quiet heartbreak standing before the worn oak counter. Elena Rowan entered without announcing herself. The bell above the door chimed softly, and every familiar face inside looked up before quickly looking away again. 11 months had changed her beyond recognition. She had once been known for her bright laughter beside her husband's forge, where sparks danced into summer evenings while Daniel Rowan shaped horseshoes and plows for nearly every family in the county. Now grief had hollowed her cheeks, poverty had worn thin the sleeves of her simple brown dress, and countless sleepless nights had dimmed the youthful glow that still lingered beneath her exhaustion. In her arms rested little Noah, wrapped securely inside a faded wool blanket stitched and repaired so many times that its original pattern had disappeared beneath careful patches. The child slept quietly against her shoulder, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of her shawl, unaware that his mother had spent the previous night awake listening to rain drip through the cracked roof of the rented attic where they now lived. Without speaking, Elena reached into her worn satchel and removed a single unopened can of condensed milk. She placed it gently upon the polished counter as though laying down something infinitely more precious than metal. Gideon Hale stared at it in silence. The elderly shopkeeper had witnessed births, funerals, harvests, and wars during nearly 50 years behind that counter, yet few sights unsettled him as deeply as the quiet dignity of the young widow standing before him. "I'd like to return it," Elena said softly. Gideon frowned. "My dear, why?" "I only need enough money to make part of today's payment." His lined face tightened. "You bought this yesterday." "I know. It's Noah's milk." She lowered her eyes. "I know." Outside, rain battered the windows harder, as though the storm itself wished to drown out the conversation neither wished to continue. Gideon carefully pushed the can back toward her. "I'm afraid I can't take food away from a child." She slid it gently toward him again. "If I miss another payment, Mr. Mercer will evict us before nightfall." Gideon's shoulders sagged. He wouldn't throw a baby into the rain. He already warned me he would. Silence settled between them. Around the shop, customers pretended to examine jars of preserves and bolts of cloth, though every ear remained fixed upon the exchange. Only 11 months earlier, Daniel Rowan had been celebrated as Ashcroft's finest blacksmith. When the Ashcroft silver mine collapsed, trapping dozens beneath splintering beams and falling stone, Daniel had rushed inside without hesitation. Witnesses later whispered that he had braced a fractured support with his own shoulders while frightened miners escaped through the narrow tunnel behind him. By the time rescuers returned, the mountain had buried him forever. His courage should have made him a hero. Instead, powerful shareholders bribed officials into declaring that faulty repairs by Daniel had caused the collapse. Newspapers repeated the lie. Lawyers protected investors. Wealthy men saved fortunes. A widow inherited disgrace. From that day forward, every debt attached to Daniel's name became a weapon. Medical bills, funeral costs, the mortgage on their cottage, loans on the forge. One by one they disappeared, not because they were forgiven, but because Silas Mercer quietly purchased every obligation before demanding immediate repayment. First Elena lost the forge, then the horse, then the furniture, then the little stone cottage where she had planned to raise Noah beside his father's workshop. Now only a damp attic remained. And even that would be gone by sunset unless she found enough money to satisfy today's demand. Gideon shook his head slowly. "I cannot accept this." "You must." "No. It's only one payment. It is your son's food." Her voice remained steady, though tears shimmered within her tired hazel eyes. "If he has no roof tonight, the milk won't save him." The old shopkeeper closed his eyes. He had quietly extended credit for months despite repeated threats from Silas Mercer, who warned that continued generosity would cost Gideon ownership of the store his late wife had helped build. Even now, unpaid entries filled pages of the worn ledger beneath the counter. Yet Gideon never regretted a single one. Near the entrance, unnoticed by almost everyone, another customer stood perfectly still beneath a dark traveling coat still glistening with rain. Duke Lucian Ashcombe had returned to England only 3 days earlier after years overseeing distant estates across Europe. At 35, he carried himself with calm confidence rather than theatrical authority. His tailored clothing revealed quiet wealth instead of flamboyant display, while observant gray eyes missed very little. He had stopped in Ashcroft merely to inspect several local businesses before reopening the long-neglected Ashcombe Manor. Instead, he found himself unable to look away from the woman refusing charity even as hardship closed around her like winter frost. He watched the trembling fingers that rested protectively against Noah's blanket. He noticed how she thanked Gideon before receiving any kindness. Most of all, he noticed that she never once blamed fate, the town, or the men who had ruined her family. She simply endured. At last Gideon opened his register, removed several coins from his own pocket instead of the till, and quietly placed them beside the milk. "I cannot refund it," he whispered. "But an old man may sometimes misplace his money." Elena stared at the coins. Slowly she pushed them back. "I cannot take what isn't earned. It would help. It would shame Daniel." The words were spoken so gently that no accusation touched them, only unwavering love for a man the world had chosen to condemn. She lifted the can once more, cradled Noah closer against her chest, and offered Gideon a grateful smile that somehow carried more comfort than sorrow. "Thank you for trying." As she stepped into the rain, Lucian quietly approached the counter, laid several gold sovereigns beside the register, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Pay every debt she owes this shop," he said. "Say nothing of me." Gideon looked from the coins to the rain-swept doorway where Elena disappeared into the storm. Before the old shopkeeper could answer, Lucian turned toward the window and caught sight of the young mother stopping beneath the church awning across the street. There, despite carrying almost nothing herself, she broke the last loaf of bread from her satchel and placed half into the trembling hands of an older widow huddled against the cold. Lucian stood motionless, watching Elena disappear into the rain with her hungry child, and for the first time since returning home, he abandoned every business appointment, driven by one question he could no longer ignore: who had destroyed a woman capable of such quiet grace, and why? Lucian Ashcombe did not return to Ashcroft Manor after leaving Gideon Hale's store. Instead, he followed at a respectful distance through rain-swept streets, never close enough to frighten Elena, yet near enough to understand the life hidden behind her quiet refusal of charity. She walked carefully to keep Noah dry, holding the patched blanket over his small head while ignoring the cold that soaked through her own sleeves. Every few moments she paused to whisper reassuring words into the child's ear, smiling for his sake even though no one smiled for hers. The road eventually narrowed behind abandoned warehouses and weathered stables where respectable families rarely ventured. At the far end stood a leaning brick carriage house whose upper loft had been divided into miserable rented rooms. Broken shutters rattled in the wind, cracked gutters poured streams of rainwater into muddy puddles, and the sagging roof seemed one harsh winter away from collapse. Elena climbed the narrow staircase without complaint, disappearing behind a faded blue door that barely fit its frame. Lucian remained below for several minutes before quietly leaving. The image of the building lingered in his thoughts far longer than its appearance deserved. He had seen ruined castles restored to splendor across Europe, yet nothing unsettled him like a place where a child was expected to grow without warmth or safety. The following morning he returned openly. Elena answered the knock with visible surprise, Noah balanced comfortably upon her hip. She recognized the gentleman from Gideon's store but knew nothing of his title. Embarrassment crossed her face as she noticed the tiny room through his eyes. A single iron bed occupied one corner beneath a leaking ceiling. Beside it rested a handmade cradle lined with neatly folded cloth despite its age. A rough table supported an oil lamp, several sewing needles, bottles of ink, and stacks of carefully copied church documents awaiting delivery. The fireplace held only faint embers, yet everything shone with remarkable cleanliness. Lucian's gaze settled upon one object hanging above the mantel: a blacksmith's hammer. Its wooden handle had been polished smooth by years of honest work. Elena noticed where he was looking. "Daniel's," she said quietly. "You kept it. It reminds Noah who his father was." Her answer carried neither bitterness nor self-pity, only unwavering devotion. Lucian introduced himself simply as the new owner of Ashcombe Manor. He explained that the estate required several iron fixtures restored before winter and wondered whether Daniel had left behind sketches or measurements. Elena hesitated, then opened a weathered chest beneath the bed. Inside lay notebooks filled with precise drawings of gates, hinges, locks, and ornamental railings, each page covered in Daniel's confident handwriting alongside careful notes she had added herself after years assisting him in the forge. "You understand these designs?" Lucian asked. "I watched him work every day. You could help recreate them. I never held the hammer. You carried the knowledge." For the first time since he entered, the faintest spark of confidence touched her expression. Lucian hired her that morning. The payment was modest but fair. More importantly, it was earned. Before leaving, he noticed unfinished embroidery folded beside the window. You sew as well? At night. And the documents? I copy parish records when the church needs extra hands. When do you sleep? She offered a weary smile. When Noah does. Over the next 2 weeks, Lucian found practical reasons to visit almost daily. Sometimes he delivered architectural drawings requiring Daniel's knowledge. Sometimes he brought ledgers needing neat copies for the estate offices. Occasionally he asked questions whose answers he already knew simply because conversation seemed to lighten the silence surrounding the lonely room. Never once did Elena ask for favors, and never once did Lucian offer charity disguised as generosity. Their arrangement rested upon mutual respect, each recognizing stubborn dignity in the other. Meanwhile, Noah slowly grew accustomed to the tall visitor. The child laughed whenever Lucian folded paper into little birds or carved tiny wooden animals from scraps carried in his coat pocket. Those simple smiles transformed the room more completely than the weak autumn sunlight filtering through cracked glass. Ashcombe Manor, however, noticed the Duke's repeated absences. Servants whispered. Visiting landowners speculated. Several fashionable ladies, hoping to attract the unmarried Duke's attention, exchanged amused smiles after learning he spent afternoons inside a widow's rented attic. Lucian ignored them all. He cared less for gossip than for the quiet determination he witnessed each visit. One evening he arrived unexpectedly after sunset. Through the half-open door he heard Elena singing. The melody was soft and untrained, yet filled with tenderness. Noah slept peacefully inside the cradle while she stitched children's gloves beneath flickering candlelight, pausing occasionally to glance toward Daniel's hammer before continuing the lullaby her husband had once sung beside blazing forge fires. Lucian remained outside until the final note faded. Some memories deserved privacy. Days later the weather turned violent. A fierce autumn storm swept across the county with relentless winds that ripped branches from ancient oaks and shattered chimneys throughout Ashcroft. Lucian ordered estate workers to secure buildings before nightfall, but his thoughts repeatedly drifted toward the fragile carriage house across town. By dawn his fears proved justified. The upper roof had partially collapsed. Rainwater flooded the tiny room. Neighbors struggled to carry damaged furniture downstairs while frightened tenants searched through broken beams for belongings. Lucian arrived just as the physician emerged from the building. Noah? He asked immediately. The child has a fever from the cold, the doctor replied. He needs warmth before it worsens. Inside the ruined room, Elena wrapped blankets around her son while trying desperately to salvage Daniel's notebooks from the soaked floor. The hammer remained clutched tightly beneath one arm, refusing to be abandoned even as water dripped from the broken ceiling onto her shoulders. Lucian knelt beside her. This place is no longer safe. I'll find another room. With what money? I'll work harder. You already work every waking hour. She lowered her eyes, unable to deny the truth. After a long silence, Lucian removed a folded document from his coat. The eastern edge of Ashcombe Manor holds several cottages once reserved for widows of estate workers, he said gently. One remains empty. I need someone trustworthy to maintain its records, oversee repairs, and help organize the neglected manor library. The position includes residents there. Elena stared at the paper without touching it. I will not accept pity. I am offering employment. She read every line carefully. Hours, responsibilities, wages. Nothing had been hidden. At last she looked up. If I fail my duties? You'll answer as any employee would. And if I succeed? Lucian smiled. Then Ashcombe Manor will be fortunate to have you. She signed her name with steady hands, unaware that beyond the shattered window, a richly dressed man seated inside a waiting carriage watched every moment with growing fury. Silas Mercer lowered the curtain slowly, his expression darkening as he realized the widow he had nearly broken was no longer standing alone, and he silently resolved that whatever bond was beginning between Elena Rowan and the Duke would be destroyed before it could threaten everything he had stolen. The widow's cottage stood beneath towering oak trees at the eastern edge of Ashcombe Manor, separated from the great house by a winding stone path lined with fading roses. Though modest beside the sprawling estate, it possessed something Elena Rowan had not known for nearly a year: warmth. Smoke curled gently from its chimney each morning, dry firewood rested beneath the porch, and sunlight reached the windows instead of leaking through broken roofs. Noah's laughter gradually replaced the silence that had settled over their lives since Daniel's death, and each joyful sound seemed to chase another shadow from the little home. Elena refused to mistake comfort for dependency. She rose before dawn every morning, lit the kitchen stove herself, prepared Noah's breakfast, and carried him across the frosted gardens to the manor before the household servants finished arranging the breakfast table. She catalogued forgotten ledgers, restored damaged estate records, repaired decades of neglected inventories, and reorganized shelves in the vast library where dust had gathered over books untouched for generations. Her handwriting was elegant enough to resemble engraved print, and within weeks, years of disorder began yielding to careful order. Lucian noticed every improvement without mentioning it. Instead of offering compliments, he simply entrusted her with greater responsibility. His confidence meant more than praise. Whenever Noah became restless, Lucian quietly appeared carrying carved wooden toys or brightly illustrated storybooks collected during his travels across Europe. The little boy greeted him with delighted giggles, reaching eagerly toward the tall Duke whose calm voice somehow soothed every childish worry. Lucian never interrupted Elena's work unnecessarily. He simply occupied Noah while she finished another ledger or carefully restored another forgotten volume. Their companionship developed almost invisibly. They shared tea after long afternoons sorting records, walked the estate boundaries while discussing crop rotations and repairs, read poetry beside the library fireplace when rain trapped them indoors. Sometimes they spoke of Daniel, sometimes of Lucian's years abroad. Often they spoke very little at all. The silence between them never felt empty. It became a place where grief slowly surrendered to trust. Christmas approached. The servants decorated the entrance hall with evergreen garlands and polished brass lanterns while villagers delivered wreaths woven from holly and pine. Elena volunteered to organize gifts for children whose parents worked the estate. She insisted every package bear no indication of the donor. Kindness should arrive quietly, she explained. Lucian watched her wrap each parcel with extraordinary care, as though every ribbon carried dignity alongside generosity. "You always think of others first," he observed. She smiled faintly. "Someone once did that for Daniel and me." "Who?" She looked toward Noah playing beside the hearth. "I never learned his name." Lucian said nothing. Neither revealed that Gideon Hale had quietly confessed who had paid Elena's store account weeks earlier, nor that Elena had guessed the truth the moment she recognized the Duke's handwriting on several estate receipts. Both silently respected the other's desire to leave the kindness unnamed. Not everyone welcomed the growing friendship. Ladies from neighboring estates arrived regularly under polite pretexts, hoping to secure the attention of Ashcroft's unmarried Duke. They expected elegant dinners, musical evenings, and flattering conversation. Instead, they often found Lucian reviewing estate maps beside Elena or carrying Noah through the gardens while discussing harvest reports. Whispers spread quickly. Some called Elena ambitious. Others suggested she had carefully planned every encounter. The cruelest claimed poverty had become her most convincing disguise. The gossip eventually reached Elena herself. One afternoon, while delivering account books to the drawing room, she overheard Lady Beatrice Fenwick laughing with several companions. "How fortunate," the woman remarked loudly. "One widow loses a husband and somehow gains an estate." The laughter that followed echoed sharply across polished marble floors. Elena quietly placed the ledgers upon a table without acknowledging the insult. She simply turned to leave. Lucian entered before she reached the doorway. He had heard enough. Without addressing the women, he picked up the ledgers, offered his arm to Elena exactly as etiquette required for noble ladies, and said calmly, "Would you accompany me to inspect the village school this afternoon?" His voice contained no anger, only respect. Elena accepted. Together they walked past the silent gathering without another word. The absence of public confrontation somehow carried greater force than any speech. The gossip never truly ended, but it no longer possessed the power to wound her as deeply. Weeks later, while reorganizing forgotten estate archives beneath the West Wing, Elena discovered an old cabinet whose warped door refused to open. After considerable effort, the rusted lock finally gave way, releasing decades of trapped dust into the dim room. Inside rested dozens of neglected survey maps, engineering ledgers, correspondence, and rolled blueprints tied with faded ribbon. Most appeared ordinary. One leather portfolio did not. Across its cover someone had written in careful ink, "Ashcroft Silver Mine Structural Reports." Elena's pulse quickened. She unfolded the first document carefully. Inspection after inspection warned of dangerously weakened support beams, unstable tunnels, and ignored repair recommendations months before the collapse that claimed Daniel's life. Every report carried official signatures. Every recommendation had been acknowledged. None had been followed. Hands trembling, she carried the portfolio directly to Lucian. He read each page slowly. His expression gradually hardened. "This cannot be right," he whispered. She pointed toward another signature near the bottom. Lucian recognized it instantly. His late uncle. The former steward of Ashcombe Manor during Lucian's years abroad. Although not responsible for operating the mine directly, he had represented estate investments connected to its shareholders. Lucian lowered the papers onto his desk. "My family knew. They may not have understood everything. They understood enough to remain silent." For the first time since returning from Europe, certainty abandoned him. The honor he had inherited suddenly felt burdened by secrets he had never chosen. Neither noticed the half-open library door. A servant passed quietly outside carrying firewood. Minutes later, another servant unknowingly repeated seeing important mine records upon the Duke's desk. By evening, the rumor had reached someone far beyond the manor walls. 3 nights later, Elena returned to the archives after remembering several uncatalogued files still waiting to be sorted. She unlocked the storage room and stopped immediately. Shelves had been overturned. Drawers emptied. Cabinets forced open. Papers lay scattered across the stone floor like autumn leaves after a storm. The leather portfolio had vanished. Only one folded engineering report remained trapped beneath a broken shelf, overlooked in the hurried search. Elena snatched it up. Hidden inside its pages she found something even more extraordinary. A sealed envelope addressed in Daniel Rowan's unmistakable handwriting. Before she could break the faded wax seal, footsteps echoed through the dark corridor beyond the archive door, slow and deliberate, followed by the unmistakable scrape of a key turning quietly in the lock from the outside. The sound of the turning key froze Elena where she stood. Instinct overcame fear. She slipped Daniel's sealed letter and the surviving engineering report beneath her shawl just as the archive door swung inward. A hooded figure glanced quickly around the ransacked room, cursed under his breath after finding nothing more, and hurried away before recognizing her hidden behind a towering shelf. Elena waited until the footsteps disappeared, then ran through the silent corridor toward Lucian's study, her heartbeat louder than the midnight wind rattling the manor windows. Lucian listened without interrupting as she described the destroyed archives and the intruder. When she placed the surviving report beside Daniel's unopened letter, he immediately summoned the estate steward, ordered trusted guards to secure every remaining record, and sent discreet messages to several retired engineers whose names appeared within the documents. He understood that whoever had searched the archives feared the truth more than exposure. That realization transformed suspicion into certainty. Morning brought consequences. Before sunrise, county constables arrived carrying a warrant signed by the magistrate. Silas Mercer accused Elena of stealing confidential estate documents to fabricate evidence against him. The officers behaved respectfully, yet duty required them to escort her into custody until the accusation could be examined. Noah cried as strangers entered the cottage, clinging desperately to his mother's skirt. Elena knelt, kissed his forehead, and whispered that courage sometimes meant walking through frightening doors without surrendering kindness. Lucian stepped forward before the constables could leave. "You will treat Mrs. Rowan with the dignity owed an innocent woman." One officer nodded solemnly. "We intend to, Your Grace. I shall meet you at the courthouse." The entire town gathered outside before noon. Merchants abandoned their shops. Miners left workshops. Children climbed fences for a better view. Some came expecting scandal. Others came hoping long-buried questions would finally receive honest answers. Inside the crowded courtroom, Elena sat quietly beside her solicitor, hands folded calmly despite the uncertainty surrounding her future. She carried Daniel's unopened letter inside her handbag, unwilling to break the seal until necessity demanded it. Across the aisle, Silas Mercer appeared confident in an immaculate black coat, greeting influential townsmen with polished smiles that barely concealed his satisfaction. The magistrate called proceedings to order. Silas's attorney rose first. He painted Elena as a manipulative widow who had charmed the Duke, stolen confidential records, and invented accusations to erase lawful debts. He insisted that desperate people often manufactured conspiracies rather than accept misfortune. Each carefully chosen sentence sought to preserve Silas's reputation while discrediting Daniel's memory once again. Elena never interrupted. She simply listened. When the prosecution finished, Lucian rose. He did not invoke noble privilege. He requested permission to testify under oath like every other witness. The magistrate granted the request. Lucian described discovering neglected engineering files inside the estate archives, identifying signatures belonging to former investors, and witnessing the deliberate destruction of those archives only days later. He presented the surviving engineering report recovered by Elena, demonstrating that inspectors had repeatedly warned of structural failure months before the collapse. Calmly, precisely, he explained that the danger had been documented, acknowledged, and ignored. Silas's lawyer objected repeatedly. The magistrate overruled each challenge. Next came retired engineer Thomas Ellery. His hands trembled with age as he identified his own signature upon duplicate inspection reports he had secretly preserved after being ordered to remain silent years earlier. He testified that Daniel Rowan had personally confronted mine supervisors, begging them to reinforce weakened tunnels before lives were lost. Instead of rewarding his honesty, investors dismissed his warnings as expensive inconveniences. Several former miners followed. One after another, they described Daniel refusing to flee while others escaped through collapsing passages. A gray-haired foreman lowered his eyes before speaking. "I owe my life to Daniel Rowan," he said quietly. "He held the beam. We ran because he ordered us to." Silence spread across the courtroom. Even those who had repeated lies for years struggled to meet Elena's gaze. Finally, Gideon Hale approached the witness stand carrying weathered account books tied together with faded string. He opened them carefully. These ledgers record every debt purchased by Mr. Mercer after the disaster. The magistrate leaned forward. Gideon continued. Medical bills, funeral expenses, mortgage notes, equipment loans. They were all acquired within days, not to help grieving families, but to demand immediate repayment before widows could recover. The dates matched perfectly. The pattern became unmistakable. Silas's confidence began slipping away. Lucian then asked permission to introduce Daniel's sealed letter. Elena hesitated only briefly before placing it into the magistrate's hands. The wax remained unbroken until that moment. Inside rested Daniel's final written warning addressed to mine management, pleading for immediate repairs because another collapse seemed inevitable. He concluded with one heartbreaking sentence. "If nothing changes, good men will die for someone else's greed." No one spoke after the magistrate finished reading aloud. The truth required no embellishment. Silas suddenly demanded permission to address the court personally. His polished composure shattered beneath mounting evidence. He blamed investors, accountants, officials, and unfortunate misunderstandings, insisting every decision had been legal. Yet each desperate explanation contradicted another until even his own solicitor quietly lowered his head. The magistrate delivered judgment before sunset. Daniel Rowan was officially cleared of every accusation connected to the mine disaster. The court recognized him as the man whose sacrifice saved dozens of workers. All fraudulent claims against Elena were permanently dismissed. An independent commission would investigate every shareholder involved in suppressing safety reports, while Silas Mercer faced immediate charges of fraud, conspiracy, bribery, document destruction, and unlawful debt manipulation. Outside the courthouse, townspeople removed their hats as Elena emerged carrying Noah in her arms. Some whispered apologies. Others simply wept. She accepted neither praise nor pity, only holding her son a little closer as church bells rang across Ashcroft for the first time in 11 months in honor of Daniel Rowan. Yet as Lucian reached her side, a uniformed messenger rode hard into the square bearing an official dispatch from the capital. One glance at its seal drained the magistrate's face of color, and every hopeful heart sensed the battle for justice had not ended after all. Snow arrived early that year, covering Ashcroft Manor in a quiet white mantle that softened every scar the long months of conflict had left behind. Smoke drifted peacefully from chimneys, lanterns glowed along the winding paths, and the widow's cottage no longer felt like a refuge borrowed from sorrow but like the beginning of a future patiently earned. Yet before peace could fully settle upon the estate, the final decision from the crown had to be delivered. The dispatch from the capital summoned every surviving shareholder connected to the Ashcroft silver mine, together with the magistrate, Duke Lucian Ashcombe and Elena Rowan. Weeks of investigation followed. Hidden ledgers were recovered from bank vaults, bribed officials confessed in exchange for mercy, and forgotten correspondence revealed how warnings had been deliberately ignored while profits continued to flow. Lucian cooperated without hesitation, even when evidence reflected poorly upon members of his own extended family. One cold morning the judgment finally arrived. Every fraudulent conviction against Daniel Rowan was erased from the official record. His name was restored with full honor. The Crown ordered compensation for the families affected by the disaster, funded by the confiscated fortunes of the corrupt shareholders. Silas Mercer's remaining wealth vanished almost overnight. His grand townhouse, warehouses, carriages, and accounts were seized. The man who had spent years collecting other people's homes walked away with nothing except the consequences of his own greed. Ashcroft changed almost immediately. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Elena now lowered their heads whenever she passed. Some approached with awkward apologies. Others simply wept. One elderly woman confessed that she had believed every rumor because believing lies had been easier than questioning powerful men. Elena listened without anger. "I cannot return the years we all lost," she said gently. "Let us make certain no family loses them again." Her words spread through the town more quickly than any newspaper. Forgiveness, everyone discovered, demanded greater courage than revenge. Meanwhile, Ashcombe Manor quietly transformed beneath Elena's influence. The abandoned widow's cottage became something entirely different. Instead of housing only one grieving mother, it opened its doors to widows left struggling after illness, accidents, and failed harvests. Elena organized sewing lessons, bookkeeping classes, embroidery workshops, and copying work supplied by the estate offices. Women who had believed themselves forgotten slowly rebuilt their independence. Lucian watched each change with growing admiration. She never sought recognition. She simply noticed suffering and quietly built solutions around it. The servants adored her because she remembered every name. The gardeners respected her because she learned their craft instead of giving orders. The stable boys smiled whenever she thanked them for the smallest kindness. Even the oldest housekeeper admitted she had never seen Ashcombe Manor feel so alive. Noah became the heart of the estate. He toddled through endless corridors laughing at echoes, chased butterflies across the gardens, and greeted every servant as though each belonged to his family. Whenever Lucian returned from inspecting farms or meeting tenants, Noah would wobble across the entrance hall with tiny outstretched arms, demanding to be carried before anyone else received a greeting. Lucian never refused. Yet he remained careful. One afternoon, while walking beside the frozen lake, Noah looked up with innocent curiosity. "Papa?" The single word hung quietly in the winter air. Lucian knelt before him. "You already have a papa." The little boy blinked. He was very brave. Elena stood a few steps away, tears filling her eyes. Lucian continued softly. "I could never take his place." Noah reached out and touched Lucian's cheek with his tiny mitten. "You stay." Lucian smiled. "If your mother allows it, I'll stay." That evening Elena found Daniel's hammer resting upon Lucian's desk. It had been carefully restored. The cracked handle had been strengthened without removing the marks left by years of honest labor. Every scratch remained exactly where Daniel's hands had placed it. Lucian looked toward the fire before speaking. "I wanted it repaired. It was already precious. It deserved preservation." He gently lifted the hammer. "This built homes." It did. It fed families. Yes. It also gave Noah his father. Elena lowered her eyes. Lucian continued quietly. "I will never compete with a man capable of such sacrifice." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Not uncertain. Simply truthful. Several days later Lucian invited Elena to accompany him to the old manor chapel under the pretense of inspecting winter repairs. Candles already burned beside the altar. Fresh evergreen garlands decorated the ancient stone walls. Near the entrance stood a newly carved oak plaque. Elena approached slowly. Across its polished surface were engraved the words, "Daniel Rowan, a man who gave his life so others might live. His courage will forever be remembered." She placed trembling fingers against the wood. For nearly a year she had fought not only poverty but the unbearable fear that Daniel would vanish from memory. Now his honor had found a permanent home. When she turned around, Lucian was waiting quietly. No grand audience. No musicians. No spectacle. Only the man who had patiently walked beside her through grief. "I have wished to ask you something for many weeks," he said. She smiled softly. "I suspected. I delayed because I needed one thing first." "What was that?" "Justice." He stepped closer. "I never wanted gratitude to influence your answer." She looked into his steady gray eyes. "You never asked for gratitude." "No. You only offered respect." Lucian drew a small velvet box from his coat. Inside rested a simple gold ring set with a single sapphire. "I cannot erase your past. I would not ask you to. I cannot replace Daniel. You should never try. I can only promise that every tomorrow entrusted to me will be spent protecting you, honoring him, and loving Noah as faithfully as I know how." Emotion finally overwhelmed the strength Elena had carried for so long. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. You gave me work before kindness. Lucian smiled. You deserved both. You defended my dignity before my reputation. You had already earned it. You never pitied me. I admired you. She laughed through tears. I've forgotten how happiness feels. Then allow me to remind you. With trembling hands she accepted the ring. Yes. The little chapel remained completely silent for one beautiful heartbeat. Then Noah clapped enthusiastically from the front pew where Mrs. Gideon Hale, invited secretly by Lucian, had been struggling to keep the delighted child quiet. Everyone laughed. Even Elena. It was the first carefree laughter she had shared since Daniel's death. Their wedding took place on Christmas Eve. Snowflakes drifted gently across the manor grounds while church bells echoed through the valley. Former miners stood proudly in the front rows, many unable to hide their tears. Gideon Hale walked Elena down the aisle with quiet dignity, his weathered hands trembling as though escorting his own daughter. Noah proudly carried a small cushion bearing the wedding rings, smiling whenever guests smiled back. Behind the altar, Daniel's restored blacksmith hammer hung beneath the memorial plaque. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been replaced. The past remained honored while the future opened its doors. After the ceremony, the great hall filled with music, candlelight, and laughter. Long tables welcomed miners, widows, servants, children, merchants, and noble guests alike. No distinction separated rich from poor. Everyone shared the same feast beneath towering Christmas trees glowing with hundreds of candles. As the celebration reached its height, Lucian quietly led Elena onto the balcony overlooking the snow-covered estate. Lights twinkled below. Children built snowmen in the courtyard. Widows who had once feared hunger laughed together around outdoor fires. The forge beside the village square had been rebuilt and renamed Rowan Forge in Daniel's honor, where young apprentices would learn the craft that had once defined his life. Lucian slipped his hand into Elena's. This estate belonged to my family for generations, he said softly. She looked across the peaceful landscape. It belongs to Hope now. Noah hurried onto the balcony wrapped in a tiny winter cloak, reaching for both of them at once. Lucian lifted him into his arms while Elena rested her head gently against Lucian's shoulder. Below them, the people of Ashcroft raised lanterns toward the night sky in memory of Daniel Rowan, the blacksmith whose courage had saved their lives, and whose sacrifice had unknowingly forged a family bound not by blood alone, but by honor, compassion, and enduring love. As the first Christmas bells rang across the valley, Elena realized that poverty had stolen her home, lies had stolen her husband's good name, and grief had nearly stolen her future. Yet truth had restored honor, kindness had rebuilt trust, and love had quietly forged a home stronger than anything the world had ever taken away.